Basically, I want to thank, first of all, the SIS, the Societies for Italian Studies UK, for funding this visit. This is part of a scheme. The Society supports early careers, and Aurora fits there, supports early career to basically present their work in the UK as part of the promotion of their career. So Aurora secured funding for this trip, and she decided, and I'm delighted that that was the case, she decided to come to Edinburgh to present her work. It is supposed to be presented both online and as a recording as well, and to a live audience. So we are fitting the criteria, and here we are, and I'm here to welcome you. I'm Federica Pedriali, by the way, for those who don't know me. I'm head of Italian at Edinburgh and have been here for a very long time. I've put long, deep roots in Scotland. So today we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, and I want to give a couple of coordinates to this. Aurora's work is primarily in the environmental humanities and human geography. She graduated from St Andrews, and here we have Derek Duncan with us. Thank you for coming. From St Andrews in Bristol. She also graduated second time as part of her PhD work from Cardiff in Bristol. And now she's a postdoc at Cork in Ireland. So this is her trajectory around a discovery. And I think that the discovery came at some point in your earlier career as part of the time in Italy, year abroad, Erasmus experience, British Council experience, all of these things that basically made you an expert on Calabria and the Aspromonte societies. So the talk today is about goat herding and how this can be read, how mountain farming and societies of the mountains in Italy can be used to read Italy as a kind of country resisting or approaching or finding it difficult to cope with modernity, and how others viewing Italy are also finding it difficult too. So it's a very rich topic and it resonates really well. And I want to mention this. This is my last item on my mental agenda. I want to mention Italy by design. It's a shame the students are not here. Oops, it's on record. But those students would have benefited from being here because, as Alessandra, who is a master's student, by the way, on the same area of interest, basically we're working exactly on the construction of Italy as a country resisting or finding it difficult to modernize or to become simply modern. So this resonates deeply. Aurora, it's over to you. Enjoy your talk. It's your day.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. So thank you everyone for being here in person and online. I know it's a really busy and stressful time, so I really appreciate it. Before I get started, also a big thank you to Federica, obviously, and for the Society for Italian Studies for the opportunity. The networking scheme is currently open, so if you meet the criteria, we recommend applying. So, goat herding in the Aspromonte. Okay. Slides forwards. Okay, one moment. Why would that be?
I don't know why would that be. It shouldn't be. Let's see. Because you've got, if the clicker doesn't work, the rest should. So this one should work. And instead it's not. Uh-huh. That's interesting. Anyone is using screen or in PowerPoint? It's a PowerPoint on screen. So basically we have the red frame, so we are showing, we're sharing. Yes, just maybe stop sharing and try again. What is this? Are you sharing? Yes, did you get the right thing to share? So if we share again, it should be, which is your document?
Yeah, I think the window issues.
That's right. Yes, so that's the one we were showing something else. Now it is showing, you can go in gallery, yeah. Yes. Yes, we're in business.
Okay, sorry about that. So this talk is taken from my wider research on mobilities, farming and ecotourism in the Aspromonte Mountains in Calabria, in Italy's deep south. As Federica said, I'm a Research Island postdoc under Sylvia Ross at University College Cork. So big thank you to them as well. In my research, I examine how complex patterns of movement, and not just human, so the movement of non-human animals, flora, and the land itself, shape contemporary cultural practices and ways of life, and how these practices and ways of life are framed within and how they challenge Western narratives of modernity. So I work in UCC, the Italian department. My background is Italian studies and cultural studies, but now also environmental humanities. In a nutshell, I draw on cultural studies to think through the processes that have resulted in the Aspromonte and goat herding becoming known and perceived of by others as backwards. Environmental humanities, on the other hand, insists on an understanding of culture through the interwoven connections to the ecologies and geologies, for example, on which any particular cultural practice depends, as well as its relationship to global systems of knowledge and power and abilities and economics. Indeed, such work often dissolves the binary between nature and culture. This is how I examine cheese making, for example, and all the component actions, physical matter, flora, and fauna required to make a cheese. Research from the environmental humanities is therefore interdisciplinary. My research draws on ecology and human geography, as well as criminology, to name a few. Taking the cultural practices of transhuman herders as its starting point, my research works to resist the conceptualization of culture in the Aspromonte only through notions of loss or having survived modernity intact. In this research, as well as in this talk, I'm attempting to complicate the typical image of the Aspromonte, the way it has become known in national discourses and the public imaginary. So I'll start by giving some background to the Aspromonte, and then I'll explore what I mean by modernity and backwardness. And then we'll take a look at goat herding today, paying particular attention to how this activity blurs and challenges this binary. So the Aspromonte are the southernmost part of Italy's Apennine Mountains, often referred to as the backbone of Italy. The Aspromonte are found in the region of Calabria, the toe that kicks Sicily. Much of the higher ground lies within the Aspromonte National Park, founded in 1989. And the physical geography of Calabria is characterized by approximately 750 kilometers of coastline, 3 mountain ranges, including the Aspromonte, and fertile plains between the coast and the mountains where industrial scale farming takes place. The image on the bottom left is just to give you an idea of the elevation of the Aspromonte and how it sits in relation to the coastline. The Aspromonte are the site of unusual geological formations such as the rock of Pentadactylo and Pietra Kappa, and they are biodiverse, home to wolves, dormice, vipers, red kites, jumping spiders, chestnut forests, orchids, all kinds of fungi, the list goes on. So that's Pentadactylo, the image on the left of the village of Pentadactylo, which sits below the rock of Pentadactylo, and Pietra Kappa on the image on the right. Humans, however, have been leaving the Aspromonte since soon after Italian unification in 1861. And this coincides with wider Calabrian and southern Italian and national patterns of emigration and depopulation over the course of the last approximately 150 years, as people started to escape from increasing poverty in agro-pastoral communities, patterns that continue today in Calabria. Internal mobilities continue to shape the region as people move from inland villages to the coast. The mountain villages of the Aspromonte are at risk of human abandonment, and many have already been entirely abandoned. Until the mid to late 20th century, poverty was exacerbated by the fact that most people in inland areas still owned very little land and existed under the remnants of a feudal society, where until the mid 20th century, and in some cases up until the 1980s, those working the land were often paid in kind. They often paid the landowners in kind. So the landowners would take a proportion of the olive oil that they produced on their land, for example. Poverty and emigration have also been exacerbated by the movement of the land itself. Throughout the 20th century, landslides, earthquakes, and floods have left a number of villages completely abandoned, but such movements are tied up with human activities like deforestation. These movements have been caught up in what anthropologist Vito Tetti describes as a national political climate, which has, since the 1950s, been increasingly less in favour of inland areas considered archaic. And this has been coupled with a lack of or very slow investment in infrastructure, so electricity, roads, running water, and medical services, for example. So what do we mean by modernity and backwardness, or environmental humanities approach to modernity and backwardness? Before we take a look at contemporary goat herding, I'll attempt to clarify what I'm referring to when I use these terms, first of all from a cultural studies point of view. The historian John Foote states in Modern Italy that Italy as a whole has often been looked at through the blinkers of a paradigm of backwardness in comparison with other countries, thus reducing Italy to Europe's backward south. This paradigm of backwardness or ideological lens relies on what John Agnew has called the simple evolutionary schemas intrinsic to Northern European discourse. Agnew highlights how this Orientalist modernity backwardness paradigm took on both temporal and spatial dimensions. And this is particularly important when we come to think about the Aspromonte, as I'll explain in a minute. Italy South was always conceived of as an extreme exemplification of this constructive backwardness in the eyes of Northern Europe. John Dickey has set out the various markers through which Italy's North has come to recognise the South around the time of unification, and especially in the years that followed. The barbarous, the primitive, the violent, the irrational, the feminine, the African. Unification of Italy has long been described as the annexation of the South by the North, and many scholars have looked at the North-South divide through a post-colonial approach. Criminality, too, became synonymous with the South around Italian unification, thanks in part to positivist criminologists like Cesare Lombroso, whose influential theories claimed that Italy's North and South were racially disparate. The South was Arab and African, and Southerners were therefore inherently predisposed to violent crime. These are long historical processes that I don't have time to go into today, but there's been much scholarship in Italian studies in the wake of Said's 1978 Orientalism to rethink how the South has been constructed as a question and as a problem from the outside. Today, Southerners are still referred to as terroni by Northern Italians, not all Northern Italians, but some. A term that originated with the migration of Southerners to the North from the 1950s to work in industries that for the most part have been absent in the South. Joseph Pugliese describes the term as a racist slur that means people of dirt or people who are the dirt between one's feet. This terroni slur, which has been used to mark Southerners as backward peasants because of a supposed proximity to the earth, in contradistinction to the modernity in the form of industry and finance in the North, is central to my analysis of goat herders. Ponte and others state that the Aspromonte are generally considered one of the most marginally and economically depressed areas of our country. According to Rob and others, the Aspromonte have become associated with two images: survival of a traditional peasant society, particularly of pastoralism, and lawlessness, particularly with brigands. So my doctoral research revealed the layered prejudice and tropes of backwardness within the region amongst Calabrians themselves. The Aspromonte is really the physical location onto which this perception is concentrated. Often Calabrians from coastal towns, which for the most part have popped up since the 1950s, consider their inland counterparts as closed, backwards, and sometimes criminal. The belief that agro-pastoral ways of life are unchanging and immobile is key. What we have here is an example of the spatial dynamics of the modernity backwardness paradigm. A constructed backwards hinterland that is the Aspromonte, and a modern coastal fringe in the local and wider imaginaries. Looking at these perceptions from an environmental humanities approach helps to pick apart further the worldview that continues to recognise the Aspromonte, the place and its inhabitants, and their ways of life as backwards. And this, in turn, works towards rewriting and thus reconceiving both the Aspromonte and the modernity backwardness paradigm. Horn and Bergweiler highlight the need to understand modernity as an anthropocentric ontology which elevated the human to the centre of creation. An environmental humanities approach works to undo the worldview that has led us to separate humans from nature as second only to God, superior to and in control of the non-human world around us. The environmental humanities pushes us to acknowledge and work to understand better the infinite ways our human lives are enmeshed with the non-human world. Scholars have come up with various terms for this: entanglements, contact zones, interactions, assemblages, and multi-species thinking, for example. Returning briefly to Horn and Bergthaler, the humanities need to acknowledge the ecological and material foundations of cultures, societies, and cultural artifacts. They need to see their work within the larger framework of the Earth's history, for example, the long-term history of humankind and its cultures, its energy sources and forms of biological coexistence. Doreen Massey's work on the fixed ideas we have of places is also relevant, and you might also take a look at Jacopo Torini's work on this too. Massey writes that when we think about a place, we are thinking about a fixed moment in time, when really the emphasis should be, and I quote, on constant movement, the inevitability and inexorability of process, on flow rather than territory, end quote. So about a month ago, I returned from a second 3-month fieldwork trip to the Aspromonte. I'm using ethnographic methodologies, so interviews, informal conversations, multi-species participant observation, in which I take part in activities such as milking, walking with the herd, and having informal conversations with herders in public and private spaces. They do spend a lot of time in bars, and tend to. But also other kinds of farmers, including those involved in wine production and the bergamot industry, as well as people in sort of wider eco-tourism activities. And I've concentrated on 2 towns and their surrounding landscapes. So there's Pentadactylo here and Bova here, with Etna in the looming in the background there. But this research also involved hiking from Pentadactylo to Staiti. It's a 6-day hike, and I've worked with farmers along the route. So mobility is central to goat herding. The herd, typically made up of humans, goats, and dogs, moves through the landscape so that the goats can forage on a variety of flora. Goats, especially the Razza Aspromontana, which is the indigenous breed that all the goat herders I've worked with raise, are able to survive off of marginal land that isn't well suited to other kinds of agriculture. So think arid conditions and very steep slopes. The rusticity, frugality, resistance to illness of this breed allows the raising of this breed in the internal areas of the province, performing a sustainable economic resource for these marginal areas. That was quoting Flottian Picone. This quotation offers a brief glimpse into how plant and non-human animal lives are entwined with human lives, economically, but also socially and culturally. Letizia Bindi describes the movements involved in herding as an example of meta-biodiversity, because the herd relies on biodiversity, which, when practiced carefully, herding works to sustain. Vidal Gons and others take this further. Transhumance practices over generations enrich soil quality, reduce erosion, as well as considerably reduce the risk of forest fires. Livestock practices of pastoral or semi-pastoral groups, especially in areas where agriculture is not feasible, facilitate carbon sequestration by soil and plants, as well as maintaining ecosystem services and increasing biodiversity. The movements involved in herding are both daily and seasonal. The herd moves up to high mountain pasture during the summer, where it's cooler, but also to allow vegetation on lower lands to grow back. Then they come back down, typically mid-autumn. And daily, herders either set the herd out on a route and wait for them to come back, or they go with the herd to make sure they don't eat neighbours' crops or be eaten by wolves themselves. However, not all goat herders are guardians of the land. Some have lit devastating fires in recent years to clear vegetation, and others have herds that are far too big to keep the ecosystem sustained, which also leads to a greater risk of landslides. Goats and goat herding are deeply entrenched in the local culture. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is the cheese and ricotta herders make during the winter and spring. Herders historically made their own reed pipes and zamponi, a type of bagpipes made from goat skins and local wood, which they would play around the fire on summer evenings. Historically and today, many herders carve wood while they sit and watch the herd, whether it's the wooden collars that some of the goats wear on which a bell is attached, wooden cooking utensils and other objects. This part of the Aspromonte is called the Area Gracanica, which has its own cultural heritage, which I'll come back to in a minute. Wood carving from this area also features Greek Byzantine patterns, as you can see on that collar. So to give you an idea of what goat herding looks like, I'm going to quickly talk through 3 goat herders and their herds. So in Bolva, we have Leo, who's in his 50s. He's a 5th generation goat herder. His father kept a much smaller herd, about 50 goats, which grazed on land that belonged to the local absentee landowner. In return for grazing, he would pay the landowner back in cheese and meat. But today, Leo has managed to buy large tracts of land in the mountains, as well as between the mountains and the coast. He has between 200 and 350 goats. That depends on whether the goats have had kids and also wolf kill. From January until June, he makes cheese and ricotta the traditional way. So he milks his animals by hand once a day. He heats the milk over a wood fire, not a gas fire, which more and more people are starting to do. And he doesn't pasteurize the milk. The cheese is made and then the ricotta, and the remaining liquid is fed to pigs and puppies, so nothing is wasted. He knows each goat individually by their coat, by the shape of their udders, and often their personality. The cheese and ricotta are for family consumption and a small network of friends. Then he spends the rest of the day, so typically 5 to 6 hours, walking with the herd, or he follows them where he can on his moped. While he's watching the herd, he's often on TikTok, where he will obviously watch videos. He likes to learn about global news on his phone. He's inherited an intergenerational knowledge of the mountain, the small valleys, the winds, the slopes, but he believes he will be the last in his family to herd. He has no children and he's not optimistic about the future. Then we come to Pietro, and Pietro is actually watching this, or he was at the start. He's joined us online, so if you're still there, Pietro, ciao. Pietro's relationship with herding really symbolizes one of many forms of return. He's 24 years old and lives just outside Bova Marina, which is the coastal settlement below Bova, where inhabitants have been moving to since the arrival of the railways in the late 19th century. Until his father trained to work on the railways, his family had always worked the land between Bova and Bova Marina as landless peasants like Leo's family. However, while still at school, Pietro convinced his father that he would like a herd of goats. So that meant waking up at 4 in the morning before school to milk the goats and make the cheese. He has a smaller herd, it's about 50. And he keeps them on his land just outside Bova Marina, but in the summer he rents land higher up in the mountains. This year he graduated with a master's in agronomy from the University of Mediterranean Studies in Reggio Calabria. In his words, he's an aspiring scholar and goat herder, and he is hoping to start a PhD. He's a traditional musician and he builds zamponi, which is what he's doing in this picture. That is the skin of a goat, which has been salted and dried, and then he's scraping away the moisture. So as part of his master's, Pietro has invented an anti-wolf collar to be worn by goats. It's still in its early stages, but the idea is it's a solar-powered device that keeps wolves away, thereby protecting the goats, but also protecting the wolves, and in turn protecting goat herding. We'll come back to this in a minute. And then in Pentadactylo, so Pentadactylo's population started to migrate to the coast during the 19th century when the bergamot industry took off. Then the 1908 earthquake, which devastated the whole area, Italy's northern industrial boom, and the threat of subsequent natural disasters led to the town's abandonment in 1971. However, 4 years ago, Rosa moved with Macca to Pentadactylo, becoming the first full-time inhabitants of the town in decades. Rosa is originally from Viterbo, so not far from Rome, and moved to Calabria in the 80s. She runs a seasonal restaurant on her terrace, 2 Airbnb apartments, and a small holding. She employs Maka, a refugee from Mali, as a goat herder. So Maka takes care of the goats, between 20 and 30 of them. He milks them, and then Rosa makes the cheese for the restaurant, which is a big attraction for visitors. He learnt to herd in Mali, and he uses specific sounds he learnt there to attract the attention of the goats here. Here in Pentedatilo, there is no summer transhumance. The whole area suffers from drought. So Maka daily in the summer will take the herd very long distances in order to get them to forage. And some years they have to buy in food, and that's a particular microclimate of Pentedatilo. And it was quite fun being with him. Every now and then he would shout for Kevin, because he's named the billy goat after his mother's cow in Mali, his mother's favourite cow. While he's herding, he teaches himself Italian using Duolingo, which teaches him Italian through his Malian language, Bambara. He listens to Malian and Nigerian music while herding, and chats on his phone to friends and family both in Calabria and Mali. As Fonte and others point out, the Aspromonte is still known more in relation to criminality than for its unique cultural heritage. And it's hard to emphasize how convincingly the word Aspromonte has become a metonym for organized crime as well as backwardness. It's true that some villages in the Aspromonte are strongholds of the 'Ndrangheta, and it's true that some goat herders in the 70s, the kidnapping area, helped to hide kidnapping victims held for ransom deep in the mountains. Some goat herders today are still involved in the drugs trade. Some Calabrian crime bosses have exploited this same association of herders and small-scale farmers with backwardness to protest their innocence when they're arrested, saying things like, "But I'm just a poor, simple peasant. How could I control an international drug route?" Criminologists di Ronca and La Bologna cite an article published in 2004 in a mainstream Italian newspaper, La Stampa, about the arrest of an 'Ndrangheta boss. The article says, "An illiterate peasant from another era was captured in a farmhouse in the hinterland of Reggio Calabria, the Aspromonte in the province of Reggio Calabria." So here we can see both this correlation between a perceived backwards population and organised crime, as well as how the modernity backwardness paradigm is conceived of in spatio-temporal terms mapped out onto the landscape. This metonymy risks unfairly stereotyping an entire area and an entire way of life. Most goat herders are not involved in these activities. However, even other local inhabitants of these areas will discuss herders through the stereotype. They have historically been marginal figures, the lowest rung of society, like other semi-mobile people. To give an example, in Volva, a member of the middle-class cultural elite said to me, "All herders are part of the 'Ndrangheta, and they are all incivili, uncivilized." Despite the rich local cultural heritage, which is so clearly bound up with pastoralism. Indeed, Leo said, in his view, the incivili are perhaps the people from Reggio Calabria, the city, who come up to the mountain and throw out their bag of rubbish, which he then goes and collects to dispose of. Herders spoke of prejudice at school as recently as the 70s and 80s, not so much by classmates, but by the nuns who taught them. They were made to feel dirty, stupid, and out of place, and they feel like they were beaten unfairly, while the nuns and other teachers treated the children of middle-class families and landowning families deferentially. Both Leo and Pietro use words from Greco-Calabro to describe their goats. Greco-Calabro is a language or dialect made up of words and phrases from ancient Greek. In other words, these phrases have been spoken since ancient Greek city-states colonized much of Italy's south. Zari means grey coat, for example, and Zerogasto means hard to milk. While today Greco-Calabro is a source of pride, the association of this language with herders and landless peasants in the past has contributed to its decline. Today's nonni discouraged their children from speaking it, as it had become a marker of shame and perceived backwardness precisely because of its association with goat herders. Today, most locals speak Calabrese, a language or dialect in which traces of other languages are also present, like French, Spanish, and Arabic. So in the goat herder profiles, numerous examples of hybridity and change surface. The practice of goat herding in the Aspromonte has constantly adapted and shifted and transformed. What we see today is very different to what we would have seen 30 years ago. The herds are bigger, we have land ownership amongst herders, so social mobility. There's a mixing of traditional gender roles, more women are herding and more men are making cheese. The use of technology, drones, mopeds and mobile phones. EU legislation that requires all animals to be chipped and vaccinated with regular visits from vets. And there are EU and national level subsidies for farmers who raise indigenous breeds at risk of extinction, and the capras promontane fall into this category. So ironically, on a state, multi-state level, we have recognition or appreciation of these goats, and by default, the practices that keep them from extinction. At the same time, EU legislation around the introduction and protection of wolves is shaping contemporary herding. This is way too complex an issue to go into detail now, but it is without doubt that as wolf levels rise, the number of attacks and goat deaths also rises. So one herder lost approximately 120 goats out of a herd of 350 this year over the summer. They feel like they're feeding the wolves. Most herders are not against the wolves being there. They believe that they belong in the Aspromonte, but they can't live with these losses. And they kind of think, if the herds disappear, what will the wolves eat? An article published on Tuesday by Pietro Orlando and his colleagues at the University of Mediterranean Studies make this same argument, that if some form of intervention is not made soon, eco-sustainable herding is likely to die out. Leo himself is thinking about stopping. Some positive news. In the last week, Slow Food has recognised the capras promontana and by default goat herding as essential for protecting the ecosystem of these mountains. Obviously, this kind of recognition needs to be considered critically, but it suggests there is a contemporary push to value goat herding, and in particular this breed. On the slides, you have a prototype of Pietro's anti-wolf collar, an example of innovation tied up with his belief in the need to protect herding for cultural and ecological reasons, but also to protect the wolf, because this is a way of keeping them at bay without resorting to more violent methods. Ethnic hybridity also surfaces in these examples, the result of contemporary flows of people and capital. Read this way, Maka's presence as a goat herder in the Aspromonte, and he has friends who are goat herders in nearby villages, so friends from Nigeria and the Gambia. This shows us that this profession is connected to global capitalist mobilities as well as colonial legacies. The arrival of people, including Rosa from further north, as well as the physical and symbolic returns to this way of life, like Pietro, illustrate how this is not an unchanging, immobile place or practice. Indeed, empty houses and the abandonment of internal villages are evidence of the Aspromonte's history of being caught up in these global flows, spanning back to the 19th century, if not earlier. We have to think about global patterns of subalternity and exploitation too, but Maka's case is very different from what is effectively the slave labour of extracted from migrant workers in industrial agriculture along the coast. If we think about Maka's Duolingo app vocalizing words in Bambara and Italian while he watches the herd, as well as the music he's playing, we see how herders from outside of this area and this culture maintain both the heterogeneity and a hybridity that has always been present. Many of Rosa's customers who come to dine on her small terrace restaurant come to sample her homemade cheese and hams and other produce. On the one hand, yes, they are travelling back inland to rediscover old traditional flavours and dishes, but considered another way, she is actively tapping into a growing eco-tourism, slow tourism market. She also rents out her 2 apartments on Airbnb and hosts hikers who are starting to come to walk a new hiking trail, which starts in Penteratilo. Workaways from around the world come to work at Rosa's, so her house and her land has become a meeting point for other like-minded people working the land or wanting to return to it. And also, herders enjoy going down to the marina too. They go to play cards, eat pizzas, and these days swim in the sea. The contemporary world of the herder is the same world as that goes on in Bova Marina or Reggio Calabria. So these examples complicate a static, unchanged, and mobile place population practice. And before I reach the conclusion, I want to draw on environmental humanities approaches that challenge these associations with backwardness further. Herders remaining, returning to, or arriving in these mountains and maintaining goat herding are examples of resistance in the face of patterns of emigration, which see not only people moving away from Calabria's internal areas, this is part of a wider national trend, but also away from more traditional forms of small-scale agriculture. Again, the Calabrian anthropologist Vito Terti describes remaining in these villages as a form of resistance in the face of the lure of a more consumerist, modern way of life. Choosing to herd in the Aspromonte is not an easy option. Aside from the stigma, it's a dangerous job and it is very physically demanding. However, in Pietro's words, you are always in contact with the environment, with nature. The concept of time like this is very different compared with life in the city. I made this decision because I like to be in contact with nature, especially with animals, with the herd, but also with wild animals. A symbolic acceptance of their own human proximity to the earth, a rejection of the idea that this is shameful, emerged in conversations with herders. Leo also implied something similar when he called those who had left Bova for office jobs in the concrete towns of the coast as pecorelle, little sheep, who do everything the state tells them, including eating rubbish from the supermarket. For a goat herder, sheep are simple and stupid. Goats know their own mind. They are harder to control, but are essentially more intelligent. But it goes much deeper than this. The ways these herders see themselves as part of the herd, as well as part of the wider landscape, the ways they communicate with the non-human world around them, speaks directly to the idea of entanglements, assemblages, and multi-species thinking. As Ryan Lash, in his work on herders in Abruzzo, has noted, herders have developed the ability to some extent to think like the different animals that make up the herd. For example, one afternoon, Leo said, "Today it's windy and raining, so the goats will be distressed. They're going to split up and they're going to walk further." However, in his words, the wolf knows this and he likes the rain precisely because of this, and he is more likely to attack. Or at the moment, the wild pears are beginning to ripen, so the goats are going to get distracted and climb trees like you see here. And it's going to be harder to keep them together, so they're also more vulnerable to wolf attacks. While out with the herders would interrupt our conversations to listen to sounds, focus on movement that I had been completely unaware of. Then typically they would walk to a vantage point to clarify if there was a predator, if a goat was stuck in a tree or left behind. Disclaimer, that goat wasn't actually stuck in the tree. From these vantage points, they often made various noises, different kinds of shouts, different kinds of whistles, and one sometimes used an air horn. Because of the position of these vantage points, these sounds reverberated off the rock, across and around valleys, often echoing numerous times. Thereby, the sole or single human voice was effectively multiplied by the physical geography. In the following clip, if it works, you'll hear a herder use an air horn to scare the wolves, followed by whistles, which if you listen carefully, you can hopefully hear reverberate, although I did try this earlier and I don't think you can hear the echo, but you'll get the idea. Certain sounds and whistles get the goats to regroup because there is a possible threat nearby, and others get them to turn around and change direction. Others are made to scare away predators. And some of the shouts or vocalized sounds are actually imitations of the sounds the goats themselves make, either when they feel safe back in the pens or when they feel threatened. As Timothy Ingold writes, the perceptual system of the skilled practitioner resonates with the properties of the environment. Herding works to maintain a certain ecosystem, an ecosystem built by entangled human, non-human relationships. And you could argue that knowledge of the herd and the wider herd, and the wider environment is used to ensure the well-being of the herd, and the well-being of the herd is essential for the success of the herder. Therefore, this could be an anthropocentric and extractivist activity in its own way. But it is a way of being in the landscape that is finely tuned to everything that is non-human. Finely tuned senses include footsteps moving over difficult terrain quickly, the metabolic needs of the herd, the knowledge of physical features, the folds and plateaus, and the places in the landscape where things have happened, knowledge of climate and weather patterns and how these will influence vegetation growth, and therefore what elevation the herd are likely to reach in that period or even that day, depending on the weather. It's a way of being in the world that feels very contemporary through an environmental humanities perspective, when you think about what ecologists and biochemists say we need to be doing today for the future. And it's a worldview in which the human plays a role amongst many, a decentered way of being in the world. As I come to dig deeper into my fieldwork findings, I want to think further through the following. How the modernity backwardness paradigm is challenged further if we think about herding in the context of modern intensive agriculture, which seeks to extract maximum nutrients or output from the soil or animals for maximum profit using the latest technology. Understanding of capitalist economic systems and trends, a top-down, expert-driven industrial agriculture, but one that destroys soils, habitats, and ecosystems into the future. I want to think about how herding in the ways I have outlined is forward-thinking, it's future-thinking. It has always been this way. It is an ever-evolving ancient practice that has slowly adapted in conjunction with societal and environmental shifts over millennia. And finally, where can we place herding in the context of other modern kinds of farming, like regenerative agriculture or agroecology, or old kinds of farming with new labels like 0 kilometre or organic? Labels which participants in this research often ridicule. So the aim of this research is not to try and answer the question, what is modern and what is backwards, but to contribute a new and more nuanced way of seeing the Aspromonte and its inhabitants, and at the same time challenge the modernity backwardness binary. The aim is to reshape conversations with an activist academic approach. In this way, this research has a decolonial aspect to it. And I'll end with a quotation by Harry West. He's talking about cheese production and more generally produce that is typically thought of as tied up to a specific closed-off territory. These products may reflect the ecologies, both human and more than human, in which they are made, but in today's world they cannot still be seen as the products of isolated places. Instead, it must be recognised that they are reproduced in complex places, shaped by complex histories of movement, both within and across borders, and by complicated struggles in which traditions are appropriated by some and disseminated by others. So thank you very much for listening.